Lore's backstory is what it is.
It's backstory.
It's a story you tell so you can tell the story.
Yeah.
Because the way it's been classically explained to me, or maybe not explained to me, like the way I've absorbed it through osmosis, if you will, is that when you're telling a genre fiction story, whether it's sci-fi or fantasy, maybe even detective fiction, anything that really differs from our world, or the world that you're setting in, where the world of your setting is different in some way from the real world we all live in, you have to build that up somehow. Even again, we're going. It's just like, even if you're only going 5 years into the future, and the only difference is that we have personal assistants that you can date because they perfectly replicate a human consciousness. Like that Joaquin Phoenix movie, Her. Yeah. Even if that's the only difference, you have to set that up somehow. You have to build that lore into the background so that the audience isn't left scratching their heads. Lore, if anything, especially in movies, which you only have 2 hours really to build to 2 hours, maybe 3 at most, maybe even less than 2 to engage with the audience. You use lore as a cushion for not really cognitive dissonance, but suspension of disbelief. Because if you dump a run-of-the-mill moviegoer into the Matrix without explaining all of the stuff that is the Matrix, they're going to be scratching their head the whole time, and they're not going to enjoy it. The thing that makes the Matrix great is that it explains just enough of what you need to understand the story without bashing you over the head with exposition. And it does it at the right time. That's another thing. The timely delivery of lore is almost more important than what is delivered. Because if we started off the Matrix with this is kind of a ham-fisted example because it's so egregious. But if we started off the Matrix with a title crawl saying, in the year 2199, the Nebuchadnezzar flies through the sewers of old Earth, trying to save the future, some shit like that, it would give away the whole plot. The fucking twist would be ruined. The movie would be stupid. It would be dumb. But as it is, we start off in the simulation, and the truth is slowly revealed to us, as it would be to Neo if he was someone living in that simulation being pulled out of it. And that's what makes it so effective. It's things like that. It's not just what lore you deliver, it's how you deliver it and when you deliver it.
What do you think the purpose of lore is?
I think the purpose of lore, and especially in a series or in a book, or maybe a book series where you have more time to develop it, is to, well, it depends on who's reading. Because for me, the lore is almost sometimes more important than the plot, because I'm a nerd. I'm an avowed out-and-out nerd. Most people, especially people who aren't out-and-out nerds, they're going to look at the lore, and it's basically going to be the stuff they need to understand the story. It's like
How would you define lore?
Oh, well, it's like I said a minute ago. It's the story you tell to tell the story.
Okay.
It's kind of like if you're telling an anecdote about the time you worked at a canning factory to your nephew, but you have to explain to him first why you worked at the canning factory and why the canning factory was in Buda, Texas, or whatever the fuck the situation is. That's the lore. All that stuff you tell us, you can tell him the story of the time you get your hand cut open at the canning factory. That's the lore.
Why do you find the lore more fascinating than the story itself?
Maybe because I just have that's where the imagination lives for me. The imagination lives in the cracks, because especially when you can do it right. That book that's probably still sitting across from you in your living room there, Gunpowder Moon. The thing that hooked me on that book, I started reading that book one night. I took my sister to tennis practice, and while she was at tennis practice, I was reading this book that I literally just picked up, I think that week, or that maybe even that day, at Barnes & Noble. This is back in 2018 when I was still in my final semester at IUPUI. And they were talking about I think Kyle Miner, who I think we've mentioned out here before, who's a professor at IUPUI, at least he was last time I checked, and teaches creative writing and things like that. The way he refers to it as you writing by brushstrokes, where you build in the lore with brushstrokes. You don't dump all the paint on the canvas with a big bucket, and that's basically what Gunpowder Moon did so well. Is the stuff that you need to know, like, oh, there's this treaty that like 5 different nations signed who parcel out who gets what parts of the moon and the resources there. They don't bash you over the head with that in like a block of text. It's sort of mentioned offhand by a character as he's conversing with another character. That's brilliant world building. And world building is basically just how you share the lore. So
how do you build lore?
Well, I'll get into that. For me, the way you unwrap the lore is what makes it so exciting. Because unwrapping a good nugget of lore is like unwrapping a really tasty piece of candy on Halloween. After you've been out trick or treating, you have this whole bag full of candy, but the ones that are really like, I don't know how to describe this, like aesthetically pleasing to unwrap, in addition to being tasty, that makes the experience that much more interesting. And the way you build lore, getting back to your question a second ago, the way you build lore is what world building is telling, and world building is what you do to make lore.
Yeah.
So they kind of feed off each other. They're very much they're a cyclical sort of Ouroboros thing, if you will. Because world building is the backstory and lore is the backstory. They're both sort of the same thing in a way. They just maybe different views on the same thing.
World building generates lore.
World building generates lore, and lore is what allows you to tell a story.
That'll be the name of the episode, is world building generates lore. That's brilliant. What's an example of bad lore?
Oh,
man. Of poorly thought out lore. Like,
oh man, let me think here. Man, it's funny because the ones that are bad, you don't remember.
Yeah,
that's how you know it's bad. If it doesn't leave a lasting impression, you know it was bad.
Yeah.
Sometimes lore is so bad that it does leave a lasting impression, but that's rare because you have to try. You almost have to try to make lore that bad, because usually when you try, because it's funny, when you put effort into it, it can never be bad. When you put effort into lore, you've put effort into it. If you don't put effort in it, then it's going to be bad. Then it's forgettable. That's what I say bad lore is. That's my answer. If you don't put effort into your lore and you sort of half-ass it, then it's forgettable and then it's bad. And then it's not done its job. But if you put effort into trying to make lore bad, it's still going to be half good. It's still going to be at least half good because you put effort into it. It's going to have this sense to it. It's like I don't know why this is the example I can think of, but it's like when you're watching a movie about aliens made for kids, and the alien characters are speaking made-up words. They're trying to make words that sound like alien words, but they still sound like human words because they're speaking them in human voice. You can only do so much to try and make things sound alien, just like you can only do so much to make lore bad. If you're trying to make lore 10 billion years ago on the planet Rebulax, the great Thranzulians, it still sounds like something, it still sounds like somebody put thought into it. Whereas if you just sort of half-ass it and like hand wave and sort of, brush it off, then people are going to forget about it because it's not going to help build the story you're trying to build.
So bad lore, bad world building, or good world building that's well thought out is what you're saying. Now, how would you define well thought out world building? Like how, and we'll construct it like this, we'll use sort of like Spacers as an example.
Mm-hmm.
Spacers is really well thought out, but you've been thinking about it for 20 years. So of course it's well thought out. You've examined.
Sometimes that's what it takes. One of probably the most legendary example of good lore is Tolkien's Legendarium. And Tolkien thought about his Legendarium for 30 years before he started writing, before he published Lord of the Rings. So there's lots of lead up to that story, and in terms of what it took for him to craft it all. Because there's the classic sort of joke that I think it's actually still somewhat true, if not entirely true, which is that he made this lore as an explanation for why he made this language. He dreamt up Elvish, and then he created a story to tell in order to use Elvish.
That's funny.
So it's kind of like, it's like if I created the Zarans and then created all this fiction for them to have a story to tell about the Zarans.
Lore for you is well thought out. That's the definition of good lore and good world building. And you told me last episode that you weren't really vibing with Babylon 5, which is fine. But that's because it's borderline fantasy. At one point, King Arthur does make an appearance in the series. So
it's just like every 90s sci-fi show, isn't it? Abraham Lincoln made an appearance in friggin' the original series of Star Trek, didn't he?
It's not dissimilar. But so I get why you'd be like, well, you're probably really right. Like, I'm about 5 or 6 years older than you. And so I was probably right in that sweet spot for Babylon 5 to really click. But you said a big part of why it didn't really click for you was that it had faster than light travel. It had things that weren't really that well thought out. So good lore for you needs to be well thought out. It needs to be grounded in science. Well, as close to modern day science as possible.
I'll say this, because I think you're sort of painting me into a corner here that I don't want to be in.
I'm not painting you to a corner.
No. You're right. You're fine. I'm not complaining or anything. But let me explain myself. The thing about Babylon 5 isn't that it's not good lore or that the lore is not my kind of lore, because it's definitely good lore. I could tell from the episodes that I watched last year. I could tell from the TV movie that I watched tonight that it's really good. That it's really good lore. Like, I don't know if you've ever seen Avatar: The Last Airbender. That's probably one of the best things. You need to watch that too. I don't know where you would stream it. I think it's on Paramount.
I'm sure I've got something that it has.
Yeah, or you could probably find a box. You probably find a box set on Goodwill.
Right.
Yeah, that's one of the classic examples, because the guys who made Avatar: The Last Airbender, they only planned on there being 3 seasons, and they had them basically written when they started making them. Just like the guys who made Babylon 5 only planned on there being 5 seasons, and they knew exactly what they wanted to do from the start. That's almost part of it right there. It's having a plan where you want to go instead of just sort of riding into the wind. So when I say well thought out, I'm not trying to imply that Babylon 5 isn't well thought out, because it's definitely well thought out. Like, they have rules for all of their physics, and their world building in terms of cultures and history and everything is in many ways more intricate than I'm willing to go. That's part of but it's just not really my scene anymore. Like, if I was still like 19 or 20, just starting off at IUPUI, for example, I would probably love Babylon 5 because it would be similar to what I'm used to.
Because honestly, when you started describing me about spacers years ago, I'm like, oh, this is like Babylon 5. Like, it's that intricate, right? It's not a shot for shot ripoff like Deep Space Nine is, but it's intricate, and it's complicated. It's well thought out. It's everything. But, so I was surprised when you said, I've never seen it. I'm like, oh, all right, well, but that's okay. My point with the lore stuff is really more trying to establish what lore is, how to make good lore, right?
Yeah.
So for you, I'm trying to find a working definition for lore right now.
Good luck. It's so nebulous because it almost depends on what type of story you're trying to tell. Because going back to what I was saying a minute ago, like if we were to start over from scratch, the 2 options I would take are keep it simple, go only 5 minutes into the future, and work around things that are relatively realistic, quote unquote, based on what we know today. So it'd be like extrapolating AI 5 years into the future, extrapolating driverless cars 5 years into the future, extrapolating different things like that, and seeing where they go, because that's like where a lot of classic sci-fi is. The other end of the spectrum is let's make it complicated and go 500 years in the future or 5,000 years into the future and have humanity spread across like 1,000 star systems, and there'd be like a galactic empire, like Foundation or like Star Wars or whatever other example you want to use.
For
And do
you,
it that
does
way.
it have to be grounded deeply in science?
Not necessarily. That's the thing. I like that. That's kind of where I'm going with with Space Surge, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. If I was to start over from scratch and like if I oh God, I don't want to speak this into existence. If I had like a traumatic brain injury tomorrow and lost all my memory of Space Surge, but I still love sci-fi, I would probably write something along the lines of Star Wars and Babylon 5, because that's
Right.
where my roots lay or lie.
Right.
It's just that Spacers, as it has evolved, has become more of a hard sci-fi story because I've tried to rein it in so I can tell a certain type of story. Because the Spacers, at its heart, is basically, what if it's basically it's taking several different things that I've liked over the years and mashing them all together. Things like The Expanse and Star Trek and Stargate SG-1 and so on and so forth.
I mean, that's the beautiful thing about, we'll call it your life's work, is it's so stretchy. You can tell whatever story you want into it, right? You can make into whatever you like. Okay, so it doesn't have to be based in hard science.
Yeah, not necessarily.
They can have faster than light travel, but it just has to be well thought out, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's fair to say, from what I'm getting from you, that with Babylon 5, while it is very well thought out, like that show is thought out 1,000 years in both directions and 7 billion years in the future, and the destruction of Earth, right? Like there's a lot of parallels with the Space Race saga in there.
Yeah.
And it's,
if anything, I think that
it's not a naive show, right? But it's a very, the levels, the morality tales it sells are on the level of Star Trek, the original series, a lot of the time, right? It's a simple show with simple characters. The good guys are good for the most part, and the bad guys are bad. Now, as the show kind of progresses, as it evolves, you have characters from in the beginning. You've got Lana Malari, who in the movie was the Emperor in the future, and then just the diplomat in the past. And then you've got Jakar from the Narn regime, who was just he's an arms dealer, he's a diplomat. And in that show, while like the main character of John Sheridan in Babylon 5 is just like a solid good guy, just like there's not a lot of gray there. It's all just, he's a white hat, right? But it's in the aliens where the complexities live. The human characters in that show are very, very black or very, very white. They're very, very good or very evil. All of the complexity, all of the sadness, the deep danger, the darkness of mankind is told to the aliens. And there's a scene that I'll never forget. It's like in season 4, because the Londos people, the Centauri Republic, used to enslave the Narns, and so they fought a war of rebellion and freed themselves. The Narns did. And there's an episode in season 4 where Londo Malari and Jakar are trapped in an elevator, and Jakar is so excited, and he just sits there, and all he wants to do is nothing, because he knows if he does nothing, he gets to watch Londo Malari die, right? He's just filled with so much fucking rage. It's beautiful to watch. And that talk about slavery and freedom and stuff, that's all in there. But it's also, it's morality tales, honestly, from a different world. The 90s were a different world.
Yeah.
In the world we live in today. It was post-Soviet, pre-9/11, 90s. Like, shit was hopeful, man. And even in Babylon 5, in the beginning, where humanity faces extinction, all the colors are very bright. everyone's like, we're gonna kill the bad guys and save the world, and we're gonna figure this out, and peace comes through talking, right? And then maybe you affect, and that lore, like you said earlier, that world very much, that show is very much of a time. And it's possible that that time is so far removed from our current world that it's hard for you to like kind of, not that the stories are simple, not that the morality doesn't translate, not that they aren't important morality stories to tell, but the way they're presented is so fucking different. Which,
yeah.
But then you look at The Expanse, and I've only seen the pilot, but I get the impression The Expanse is kind of like, you know, every billionaire's wet dream.
It's much more gray area. It's much more of a 2000s, 2010 show, because the guys who wrote it, I think I've told you this, the guys who wrote that, because there's two guys who wrote the Expanse books under a single pen name. They were like a partner team called, their pen name was James S.A. Corey. They started off as like assistants to George R.R. Martin. So that tells you the kind of background they have.
Okay.
So this is it's basically been called Game of Thrones in space, because there's like, you know, political intrigue and stuff like that, and all sorts of stuff, and all sorts of like gray area, morally gray characters, and bad decisions being made for the right reasons, and good decisions being made for the wrong reasons, for the wrong reasons. It's really complex and intricate, and that's kind of one that I do kind of like that, because that's how life is.
Yeah, life is very, you know, I say that, but I'm also a pretty black and white guy.
I mean,
I'm much less black and white than I used to be.
If anything, the thing I was going to say a minute ago, if anything, the reason probably why I just never really picked up Babylon 5 or I never really got into it when I started watching it last year, is not necessarily just that it's naive, comes from a more naive, less cynical time, but that I wish I could be that way myself more so, and I know I'm not anymore.
Yeah.
Because I'm deep down, I'm an optimist, but I'm also an abused optimist. You know, there's that line, you know, what is it? I think it was Kurt. It might have been Kurt Vonnegut. No, it was George Carlin. He said, "Inside every cynic, you'll find an abused optimist."
I know what you mean. I myself am a deeply patriotic guy, and I recently visited you and then visited our nation's capital and saw the Declaration of Independence and all the founding documents, and just I did DC in 36 hours.
Yeah.
And there's patriotism and nationalism, right? Nationalism has a bit of a religious bent to it at times, depending on how deep you go into it, where you love your country, but also you assume accuracy. You assume correctness. You know, it's when part of your national story is like a divine manifest destiny. You know, you assume by default that, you know, your nation is shepherded by the Lord God. So, you know, it would be hard to look at that and be like, oh, well, we were wrong here. Well, how could we be wrong? Because God led us here, right? Now, that's nationalism with a little bit of religion sprinkled in for fun.
Yeah.
And
it's funny how often those two do go hand in hand.
And I wasn't, that was my mode of thinking back then. It was by default, you know, I automatically gave America the benefit of the doubt, even though I was a soldier and I knew how the sausage was made. And when I went to DC recently, I had realized that I was a different guy, kind of like how you're you're not capable of that sort of level of naive optimism because you've seen too much of the world. And my patriotism, while still there, is much less, wearing, I wear like American, I would look like Apollo Creed in Rocky 4, and which is all great fun on the 4th of July and everything. But that was a very surface level, 2-dimensional version of my patriotism, and I think over the pandemic, I think over the Russian-Ukraine war, I think over my time as a civilian, I've deepened my love of nation, but it's moved away from the sort of, flags and like, and so going to DC didn't hit me the same way now that it would have 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It would have been this reverent experience. Going to Ground Zero, New York City, was like taking a trip to Mecca. It was seeing that I looked at the Statue of Liberty, and I didn't know that she walked. I didn't know that her legs were bent, and I broke into tears, and I said, "Oh my God, she walks." I didn't know that. It was a religious experience. It was, and because that was more of, the deeper patriotism I discovered of Lady Liberty beckoning people to be free, of the horrific day of Ground Zero of 9/11 that sent my whole generation off on a fucking adventure. And that was where my country was, the flags and the trappings and the documents and everything. That was all great. It was all great to see, but it didn't hit me the way I always thought it would. So sorry, this is a little bit of a tangent I'm on.
You're fine.
But I could see where you're like, oh, I've changed. And so Babylon 5 doesn't quite hit me the way it would if I was a little bit more naive, a little bit younger.
Mm-hmm.
So I get that. Right.
Yeah.
I am unable to assume the absolute best by default. When that's really important. Like Jon Stewart said that, like, if you love your country, you should want it to be the absolute best version of itself, and then you should interrogate it, and you should push it. You should, nationalism's lazy. Nationalism says, oh, well, we're the best, and so you don't really have to try.
Yeah.
Patriotism means I love my country so much, and I am going to work every day to make it as best as it possibly can.
Yep.
And it's okay if you love your country. It's great. I love my country, and I don't, it's the best out of a bad situation called life on planet Earth, but because there's places on Earth that are really, really bad, and America's pretty fucking awesome. I think we lose track of perspective. We lose track of the world. We get caught up in our own lore sometimes. A country is just a bunch of people with the same story, right? Mm-hmm. The same lore, the same background. We have the lore of the founding fathers and stuff, and there's versions of the truth of the history, right? Yep. And like you said earlier, the lore, the world building is what you do. But why are you more interested in the details of the world and not the story of somebody?
Well, I don't know. Maybe I'm not. I think it's more that I'm as interested in both as I am. I'm as interested in one as I am in the other. Most people just see the lore as sort of like window dressing or like set decoration, so to speak. I see them both as equal partners. because to me, the type of world you're building to tell your story is important as the story you're telling in that world.
Yeah.
I've become less so over the years, especially
Yeah.
as I've started writing, because like, there's some people who almost exclude people on Tough Sci-Fi, for example, the Tough Sci-Fi Discord server, who almost exclusively do world building. Like they'll meticulously plan all the little details of their spaceships and all these things. It's like, well, you never actually write anything. It's like, well, yeah, but I have more fun doing this. Well, that's fine. I have fun both designing the lore and the like settings and all this stuff, but also writing the stories, which are about characters and the lives of the characters and the struggles they go through. But the thing that's always traditionally gotten me the most in a story, maybe not the most, but even if it is the most, it's definitely slight, but is the stuff that makes it, is that special sauce that makes it unique. Another good example is a book that I have actually with me here in Maryland called Red Moon, which is set like, I think it came out maybe 5 years ago or so. So it's set about 30 years in the future. So like late 2040s. And it envisions a future where China has taken the lead in the moon race.
Okay.
And they basically, China and the United States and a couple of other countries and corporations have colonized the lunar South Pole, and they're just sort of doing their thing. And the crux of the story here is that this guy who's like a diplomat from Earth, who's like, no, he's not even a diplomat. He's like a quantum computer engineer. He's taking a new quantum computer up to the moon, and he inadvertently becomes wrapped up in this conspiracy that some shadowy people from the Chinese government are doing to try and take power. And the sort of world building that is laid out, not just in terms of like sci-fi stuff, but also political stuff and cultural stuff, is really enthralling. It's like, oh yeah, you can see how it's been painted in here. You kind of have to like peel back the layers. Like I said before, it's like peeling open a really nice piece of candy, where the wrapper is fun in addition to the candy itself being tasty. So that's to me part of the fun is finding those little tidbits where it's like, what's another example from Gunpowder Moon, which is probably my favorite book ever.
Well, the thing that sticks out to me the most that you told me before is how on the set of Blade Runner, they had a whole room, and in that room they had drawers full of pill bottles, and they had the pill bottles in there. They had labels on them and everything, but you never saw it in the movie. Deckard never took the pills, and it just was there. But you were so struck by that, where it was like, oh, it was that little detail. It was a world you could escape to, right? And what I like about the Spacers saga is how you've thought things out that detailed, right? Because I'm very different in that regard, where when I'm creating the world, I'm like, oh, I'm sitting at a table with chairs, and I would be most interested in having someone sit across from me, and then there's a conversation, and then maybe like, I don't know, there's a news broadcast in the background about robots or something, but it's not super, for me, it's not super thought out. It's not, it's like one of the reviews I had for the Liberation of Earth was that, oh, there's no plot. And it wasn't an insult. They said there's no plot. It's two people discussing a moral issue. And this isn't
that's totally fine.
Yeah, this isn't like
yeah,
good or bad. This is just the difference there. And so your perspective on this is I'm completely fascinated by it. And that's probably why we work so well together, because we focus so completely on two different aspects of it, where you're the lore guy and I'm the two people talking guy.
Yeah.
And
because there's been whole movies made about both, around both what would you say? Both styles. There's been you could fill warehouses with film reels from art house movies that are basically just conversations between people and that have been like creatively edited together. You could also fill warehouses with film reels of epic movies that have really deep lore and creative backstory and all that stuff.
Yeah.
The Marvel Cinematic Universe comes to mind. Star Wars comes to mind. Star Trek comes to mind. Obviously, Babylon 5. All these things, and neither one of them is should be mutually exclusive of the other. Because a story that has lots of intricate lore can also have intricate conversations, just like intricate like human interest pieces in them, and human interest can also have lore.
Outside of Spacers, is there a particular lore that strikes you the best? Is there a well thought out? Because you like lore because it helps you escape into different worlds, right?
Yep. Oh man. Well, I mean, I've listed a lot of them. Star Wars has always really impressed me because George Lucas knew what he wanted to do. Obviously he made up a lot of it as he went along. That's we're not going to argue that. That's a given. But he also had lots of really cool ideas. And not only did he have lots of really cool ideas, he knew how to run with them. Like if someone would come to, if like one of his creative staff would come to him and say, "Hey George, we need some copy or whatever you would call it for this character," he'd come up with it like on the fly. And it's just so amazing how this dude who basically dreamt up Star Wars while he was recovering from an auto accident at age 18 was able to turn that into literally a multi-billion-dollar franchise. So he's always been kind of a hero of mine. Gene Roddenberry is another one. He dreamt up this universe basically as a way to tell stories to help try and heal some of the wounds of World War II and stuff like that. He served in.
Yeah.
And there's so many great stories. I can't even think of any of them really. But you probably heard of many of them yourself.
It's not as important for me, I don't think,
Mm-hmm.
for it to be as thought out. If the characters are believable, I'll buy it.
Yep.
I or maybe it's because I'm like, oh, I don't feel the need to drop myself in a story. I want to hear someone. I'm more interested in meeting the person and not playing in their world, if that makes sense.
Yep.
And which, it doesn't make it more valid than you wanting to meet the person and play in their world and see how many pill bottles they have in their cabinet, which makes you sound like a drug addict, which you're not. But
how do you know?
Well, okay, so we're to cut this part.
Joking, dude.
I know. But also having a well thought out world is pretty great. And I might take that for granted sometimes. I don't know. But I never really developed that muscle, or it's not a muscle I don't think I have as much. Which I think is why I'm like, oh, I can just take my ideas and bring them to Nick's sandbox, and then we can all play in there. Anyway, sir, I think on that note, we'll wrap up our 100th episode. Do you have any other thoughts on Spacers, the Erebus effect, on being a member of the podcast, on publishing when Divided by Zero books?
Man, you kind of hit on all the high notes so far this episode. You said you were how glad you were that we could do this. I got to tell you how glad I am that you brought me on board. Having you as a creative partner, we've touched on this a lot in the last 16 or however many episodes it's been since I joined on as a co-host. But having a creative partner who respects the work and is a fan of the work, in addition to wanting to make money off the work, I cannot tell you how happy that makes me, because there's so many people who would glom onto something because they think it's an easy way to make money. And I'm not saying that we're not trying to do that too, but with our partnership, both of us respect the work. Obviously, I respect it because, like you said already, it's my life's work. But you also respect it because pretty much from the first time I started pitching Spacers to you, as I think you touched on in this episode or last episode, you realize, oh, this is really intricate. This reminds me of Babylon 5. You were sort of a fan from the beginning, and you kind of always stayed that way. That's really great.
Agreed. Okay, we will end it there.
Yep.
And we'll talk about it afterward. For the Blanket Fortress of Solitude, I am Derwin.
And I am Nick.
We will see you next Monday morning at 0700.
Hello, stranger. Do you like to read?
Read? What's happening?
Am I dead?
I bet you like zombie books.
I like food. Do you have food?
You don't need food at dividedbyzerobooks.com. It's full of nutrient-rich science fiction.
Ugh, I'm stuck in an ad, aren't I?
Once I stop talking, reality will collapse until someone plays this ad again. This isn't the first time we've had this discussion, and it won't be the last. Hello, stranger. Do you like to read?
I didn't tell you this. I have a playwright monologue workshop tomorrow.
Ooh, cool.
And it's at the Indie Fringe Theater, and it's like a couple hours or something. And so I'm gonna go there and learn how to write a monologue. And that'll be I'm taking this writing class right now where it's basically they list prompts and then you get it's a veterans writing, it's ASAP.
Yeah.
And there's writing prompts and pictures, and they're like, why did you write about this and where did it speak to you, and then stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And much like when we took the first aid class recently, I'm trying to not take the class over. As she navigates a pandemic, late-stage capitalism, while pretending everything is totally fine, Sloane lives alone with her dog, Moose. Struggling with this juggling act, Sloane breaks down one night and wishes magic were real. The next thing she knows, she's having a conversation with her dog and levitating a spoon in her kitchen. Subscribe now to Versatile Ambitions on Substack and read the first chapter of Once a Millennium today.